This is the story of our cruise in 2009. Our boat was a Rustler 36 called Ariadne. Dan and I were the crew. We worked our way along the south coast of England to the Scilly Islands. There was a slow crossing to Ireland. Gradually we edged along the south coast of Ireland, round the corner, past the great bays of Bantry and the Kenmare River, eventually reaching Dingle, where we were weatherbound for 10 days. Next was a long passage to the Aran Islands, which we regarded as the beginning of our cruising ground. The final leg was to Clew Bay, which was our objective. Then we slowly pottered back, calling at many interesting places and dodging some very mixed weather. 2009 was one of our best cruises. As usual, we started by thrashing down to the west, departing from the bridge at the end of the Needles Channel and heading towards Studland. Following an overnight stop at Studland, we set off mainly under engine on our way to the west. After passing Anvil Point, we rounded Portland and set off across Lyme Bay. The weather was such that most of this passage was motoring. Despite the recession, there were still some container ships moving into Lyme Bay to drop off or collect deep-sea pilots. After a brief overnight stop at the pool at Dartmouth, we rounded Start Point, still under engine. That night, we went into the Yelm. From the Yelm, we had a passage that was partly under engine and partly under sail. We passed Rame Head. The Dodman is the main landmark on the way to Falmouth. We met up with our good friends Mark and Anne on Midday Sun and sat out some bad weather up at the Ruan pontoon. There are numerous ships laid up in the Fal. After a visit to Falmouth, the freshening easterly winds enabled us to anchor off St Just. From there, we made our way round to the Lizard and across Mounts Bay to Newlyn. We left Newlyn early in the morning and had to motor most of the way to Land's End and past the longships. Then we were able to sail for a long period across the separation zone until we approached the Scilly Islands. Eventually the wind died and the engine had to go on again to enable us to motor across the north of the Scilly Islands and to turn into New Grimsby by the early afternoon. We were carrying charts for both France and Ireland. Now we had to make a decision. With a period of moderate southerly winds forecast, we decided that we would take the chance of going to Ireland. The weather had now settled down and it was tempting to stay in the Scilly Islands for a few days, but with the prospect of docile weather, we decided to press on to Ireland the next day. In the event, our crossing of the Celtic Sea was under power the whole way. The sea was flat and empty. We only saw the one fishing boat all the way across. There was a glorious sunset, and before dawn, we could see the lights of the Kinsale gas field. The sun was fully up by the time we could see the old head of Kinsale. Rather than go up to the marina, we turned into Sandy Cove and anchored for the rest of the day while we caught up on sleep. The next morning, we moved up the river to the Kinsale Yacht Club marina. We were soon to discover that everything in Ireland is expensive, including marina fees. Nevertheless, Kinsale Yacht Club does make you very welcome, and the Wi-Fi service is effective and included in the marina price. We spent 3 days in Kinsale while the wind veered and freshened. This gave us plenty of time to explore the town and to enjoy the excellent catering in the restaurants and at the yacht club. The training ship Tenacious came alongside the marina for one night. Watching her leave was interesting, using a previously laid anchor to haul off and 2 dories with outboards as tugs. On the 6th of June, we left Kinsale in a very fresh northwesterly wind. We ran out to the old head of Kinsale under main only. After jibing, we had a fast reach in flat water and 1 reef in the main. We raced across Court McSharry Bay, past the Seven Heads and across Clonakilty Bay. There were several other boats about, but it took us an embarrassingly long time to pass this little vessel that was making tremendous headway in the brisk wind. There were also some heavy showers about. Passing close to Galley Head, we hardened up to pass inside the Dulick Rocks. As we closed the shore, the wind became quite shifty. After rounding Goat's Head, the engine was started so that we could find our way up the channels to Glandore, a pretty village. It was our first new harbour of the cruise. However, we were keen to take advantage of the northerly winds to press on to Baltimore, so we did not go ashore. For the next couple of days, the weather looked settled, but the longer-term outlook did indicate some vigorous activity moving in from the Atlantic. In a moderate northwesterly wind off the land, the water would be flat, so it was possible to take the route inside the off-lying rocky islands. Leaving Glandore, the pilotage instructions suggest that you should hug Eve and avoid Adam, these being 2 rocks at the entrance to the harbour. Our route then skirted Belly Rock with only half a metre over it, and shaped a course through the narrow channel between High and Low Island on one side and the mainland on the other. After passing the entrance to Castle Townshend, we passed outside Horse Island and headed for the gap between Towhead and the Stags. Finally, after passing Kedge Island, we headed into the entrance into Baltimore, which is clearly marked by a white pillar known as Lot's Wife. We had a couple of nights in Baltimore anchored off the town. The forecast was indicating approaching bad weather from the west, but we reckoned we had just about enough time to get around the corner to Dingle. On a grey day, we set off south of Shirkin Island and through Gasconane Sound. Out to sea we could see the Fastnet. The wind freshened and the visibility cleared as we rounded Mizzen Head. Somehow, Dunmanus Bay always looks unwelcoming, and it was almost with a feeling of relief that we passed Sheep's Head and headed off across Bantry Bay towards Castletown Bearhaven. It was a brisk sail, and we were glad to gain the shelter of Bear Island and turn into Dunboy Bay where we anchored. This left us in a good position for an early start out towards Dursey Sound the next morning. However, we were disappointed at the property development at Dunboy. What had previously been a quiet and remote anchorage was now dominated by something that looked rather like Colditz. It was quite tempting to go up the beautiful Bantry Bay or into the marina on Bear Island, but we were determined to make use of the favourable winds to get as far to the west as possible. Conditions were docile as we motored away from Dunboy, passing Blackhead on our way out to Dursey Sound. Unbelievably, we once again got a rope round the propeller, but fortunately I had removed the rope cutter, so the rope became clear with a quick reversal of the engine. Gently, we eased through Dursey Sound. was sunny, and there was a gentle breeze from the west to northwest. A few miles to seaward, we could see Gull Rock with its lighthouse perched on top, and the strange Cow Rock with its fantastic arches. The original plan had been to press on to Valentia, but the wind shifted and freshened, so it was going to be a hard slog. Instead, we tacked and had a very fast fetch past Dinish Island to the amazing little natural harbour of Derryman. The entrance is narrow, but the leading marks are clear. Anybody sailing this coast really must visit this wonderful harbour. However, in severe southwesterly weather, it would be possible to get trapped, as the entrance could be very dangerous. The next morning, the wind was very light and the sea was flat, so it was engine all the way. Passing inside the islands, we set course towards Bolus Head, which appeared to have a face carved on it. To seaward, we could see the magnificent Skelligs. They stayed with us for most of the rest of the passage. After passing Puffin Island and Bray Head, we proceeded along the north coast of Valentia Island. After rounding Port Point Light, we picked up the leading marks and turned into the anchorage just inside the harbour. Our intention was to make a lunch stop here and hope that the wind filled in during the afternoon. Our hopes for additional wind were not met, and we motored across to Dingle. Right on cue, Fungi, the Dingle dolphin, put in a brief appearance. After entering the harbour, we were given a comfortable berth just inside the hammerhead. This was to be our berth for the next 10 days, while it blew hard and occasionally rained hard. Dingle is a good place to be, with excellent supplies, including fresh seafood and a free Wi-Fi service that enabled us to contact all our friends and keep up to date with the progress of the weather. While the English Channel basked in fine weather, we experienced a mixture of adverse northerly winds and very strong southerly winds that were kicking up a big swell in the Atlantic, neither of which was suitable for the next 80-mile leg to the Aran Islands. It would be well over a week before settled weather reappeared. There were several cruising boats in the same position, and we got to know each other quite well. We had seen a large French ketch leaving the Scilly Islands as we arrived. We introduced ourselves, and she turned out to be a boat called Skøyen, built in about 1910 in Norway. She had been in French ownership for many years. She is nearly 50 feet long and displaces 19 tons. The day after we arrived, David Clements, who used to have a Rustler 36, arrived with his crew on Bagheera, a Bowman 40. His plan was to leave the boat in Dingle for a week, and he invited us to join his end of a cruise dinner at a restaurant in Dingle. He would have a new crew for the next sector. This was the place where Fergal, our little Irish bear, joined the crew. On one day, we took a bus trip to Killarney. The route goes along one side of the Dingle Peninsula. Then the road climbs over the hills of the peninsula and drops down on the other side near Samphire Island. On the other side of the bay is the yachting harbour of Fenit. The route then drops down into Tralee, where you change bus before going on to Killarney. The return trip gave us the opportunity to look at the hills surrounding Mount Brandon. Eventually, we caught sight of the bay as the road dropped back down into Dingle. Dingle is a good place to be, but as our stay approached 10 days, we began to develop a bad case of harbour rot. We were increasingly anxious to move on. At long last, a region of high pressure started to move up into the Atlantic, and it looked as though we were going to get a period of winds between west and north for several days. Unfortunately, this ruled out a visit to Fenit, which would have put us downwind of almost anywhere, with the prospect of having to beat our way out. So, at first light on the 20th of June, we motored clear of Dingle and headed for Blaskett Sound with the aim of reaching the Aran Islands in daylight. We knew that Scoia'n would be following us. Once fully into Blaskett Sound, the engine was turned off and we began the 65-mile reach. As we emerged from Blaskett Sound, the sea was very rough with reflected waves coming off the cliffs. Once clear of Blaskett Sound, the seas became more regular. It was about at this point that we encountered a large pod of dolphins that stayed with us for several minutes. Unfortunately, I failed to get any pictures of them, either still or video. Every hour or so, we turned on the plotter to check position, course and speed. This is the NavView display, available with the Noble Tech Chart software. It's wonderfully clear. As the day wore on, the cloud ceiling lifted and there were even occasional patches of blue sky, and the wind moderated. Nevertheless, we were able to maintain a good speed. The sun was still well above the horizon as we entered Gregory Sound. The last time we had been through this sound had been during the night, so it was interesting to see the incredible layering of the cliffs, both on Inishmore to port and Inishmaan to starboard. The light was just beginning to fade as we passed Straw Island Light. A quick tack round the lighthouse, and we found we could easily lay into Kilronan. At first we had to anchor, This turned out to be because of a race rally from Galway. Some 2 hours later, Scoia'n arrived. We were surprised that she had not caught up with us. Next morning, we were able to take stock of our surroundings. This was our first visit to the Aran Islands, although I had made a brief visit when assisting Tim Kilroe with Air Aran many years ago. It is a busy, working harbour with all kinds of ferries coming and going. Air Aran operate frequent services to and from Galway. With EU money, a large new harbour is being developed, ostensibly for the fishing. However, there does not seem to be much fishing going on, and I suspect this will become a ferry terminal and a marina in a few years' time. As the ferries arrive, minibuses, ponies with traps and bicycle salesmen descend on the disembarking passengers. The ferries congregate at the end of the pier, quite often waiting until their charges return later in the day. On our second day on the island, the cloud base was very low, but despite that we decided that we would take the standard minibus tourist trip. The pattern seems to be to drive across the island to the little village near the Bronze Age fort of Dunangasha. This still leaves you with a walk of nearly a mile to the fort, which was more than Dan and I were prepared to tackle. We did walk a little way along the path, and it gave us an opportunity to look at this strange island with its remarkable karst landscape. There are more than 700 miles of dry stone wall on this tiny island. Lunch was a welcome bowl of hot soup in the quaint little cafe in the village. The minibus tour continued around the island, but the visibility remained persistently bad, so we did not see many of the expected views. We did, however, call at the site of the 7 churches, and the driver's commentary gave us some amusing anecdotes about island life. It was a good day out. On our return to the harbour, I recognised one of the boats on an adjacent mooring called Muscadet. It belongs to Ivan Sutton, an Irish artist who he had met in Dingle when we circumnavigated Ireland in 2003. It was good to have a chat with him. We spent 3 nights at Aran. Then we had a day of gentle easterlies. Patrick and Anne-Marie needed to press on, so they decided to motor on to Inishbofin. We had now reached our cruising area and opted instead to have a gentle sail towards Roundstone. After motoring out towards Straw Island, we were able to bear away and set the cursing chute. Slowly, we edged away from Aran and past Gollum Head. It was warm and sunny, and the Connemara coastline stood out clearly below a blue sky patchworked with fluffy white clouds. This coastline is littered with rocks, and the chart plotter certainly makes pilotage a lot easier when short-handed. We edged inside the Skird Rocks and around the Tonyeel Rocks. Then, after passing Deer Island to port, we picked up the entrance to Roundstone and headed gently in towards the beacon. As we needed an early start the next morning, we opted to pick up one of the visitors' boys outside the shallow bar. We had a quiet night, but left very early to make sure of catching the tide past Sline Head. There was some overnight cloud and mist, and in the early dawn it produced some dramatic lighting effects as we picked our way through the rocky islets. On the previous occasion, when we rounded Sline Head, the visibility had been about 200 metres, so this was all new to us. As we approached High Island Sound, the wind died and we motored between High Island and Friar Island approaching Inishbofin, we picked up the leading marks. There were quite a few yachts in Inishbofin, including Skøyen, and we found space to anchor close by. It seems Skøyen was needing some spares and Patrick was having a frustrating time trying to get them delivered. Since our previous visit, the facilities at Inishbofin had been greatly improved. There is a new terminal for the ferries that are coming and going all day, and a new fishing boat jetty that makes it easier to land in the dinghy and to get water. A lot of the local fishing is still done using curras. With large outboards on the back, they tend to squat, which is why the extra boards have been added at the stern. We visited Day's pub, and I purchased 1 or 2 essentials at the tiny shop. However, we were anxious to keep moving while the weather was suitable, reckoning that we could stop at Inishbofin on the way back. Patrick had some arrangements for his engine parts to be delivered further north, and he set off, but he was facing a fairly hard fetch. He was anxious to keep going as his target was to get to Norway for the winter. The wind was brisk, but we did not fancy windward work. We reckoned that we could make Ballynakill on one tack. That would position us for the expected easterlies the following day. It was fairly grey as we sailed past Lion Island, with reefs in both the Main and the Genoa. Suddenly, we were headed and had to throw in a short tack to enable us to lay the entrance to Ballynakill. Entering Ballynakill requires careful pilotage, so as we reached the first rocky island, the Genoa was furled and we motor sailed carefully along the north coast of the loch, passing first the Carrigeen rocks and then the Ardar rocks before anchoring off Derrynfa. This is about as close to the 12 Pins Mountains as it is possible to get. The weather now improved and the view was stunning. Within minutes, a local resident was alongside in a dory to welcome us, offering to get some water and putting us in touch with another local, John Ruddy, who we had met in 2003. It was most welcoming. I went ashore with him to get the water. An hour or two later, just before he set off in his boat for Inishbofin, John Ruddy dropped 8 mackerel fillets on board. In a brisk breeze, we ran clear of Ballynakill the next morning. Once clear of the loch, the wind faded and the reefs were shaken out as we hardened up to pass inside Inishturk. This island has a smaller population than Inishbofin. The wind freshened, so the main was reefed again as we sped towards Runa Point, where the wind died again and the engine had to go on. We motored towards Clare Island, which had been one of the principal objectives of our entire cruise. Under a large cloud cap, it looked quite ominous. As we got closer, the wind freshened to a brisk force 5, blowing straight into the tiny harbour. Reluctantly, we decided that staying there would not be comfortable, but we furled the Genoa and sailed slowly along the coast, getting an excellent view of Grace O'Malley's castle. In Elizabethan times, Grace O'Malley, otherwise known as Granwell, had controlled much of the west coast of Ireland through sheer piracy, and she owned several castles. Reefed again, we hardened up on the starboard tack with the wind almost due east. To the north of us, we could see Achill Head. Our tack took us fairly close to Achilbeg Light, which must be one of the most remote spots anywhere. Eventually, we were headed and had to put in a clearing tack, but the wind rapidly shifted into the northeast, and our course took a huge handrail that led us almost into the entry point into the islands of Clew Bay. It was this jumble of islands that had attracted me, and this was the ultimate goal of our cruise. We had made it. Unfortunately, the cloud was low, but this did not matter. This was a strange, peaceful, remote anchorage. The next morning, we worked our way slowly through the meandering channels until we emerged near Westport and turned back out to sea. we passed the tiny lighthouse of Inish Port. Recent forecasts had indicated the possibility of fog, and the visibility was certainly suspect as we motored across Clew Bay back towards Clare Island. Rounding Runa Point, we were careful to avoid the dangerous black rocks. The visibility was improving and the coastal scenery was amazing. Eventually, the breeze filled in and we were able to beat quietly down the coast in the gentle southeasterly wind. Mount Wheelwray, the tallest in Connaught, came abeam as we started to look for the leading marks into Loch Killary. We crossed the entrance to Loch Killary and motored into the peaceful anchorage of Salrock. The sun came out and we enjoyed a warm afternoon in the cockpit. I went ashore to take some pictures. We woke the next morning to find a strong easterly blowing, as had been forecast. We were content to chill out for the day, watching the cloud cap blow over Wheelwray. Forecast was for force 5 to 7, increasing gale 8 from the northwest. It was going to blow for a couple of days, so we wanted to get to Inishbofin, less than 20 miles away. With 2 reefs, we set off, piloting carefully through the rocky outcrops, including O'Malley's breaker, which never quite shows above water. Despite the forecast, the wind dropped as we approached Inishbofin, but there was a nasty slop on the sea, so we had to motor for the last hour. Just after we anchored, we saw John Ruddy dropping a buoy and heading out to sea. We hailed him, and after a brief chat, he offered us the use of his own buoy, which we occupied for the next 3 days. It was in a quiet corner of the harbour, and we were very grateful. The end of June was coming, and it looked as though the spell of fine weather was also coming to an end. The next day, the 29th of June, it blew hard, and we went ashore to the new hotel for a lobster. It was good. In this wild spot, we were surprised to find lilies growing in the shelter of a cottage wall. Then, although the wind dropped a bit, the weather was grey and wet, so we stayed put. Dan went ashore to the island shop. This little hut is the only shop on the island, but if you know your way round, you can find cottages that sell different things. I had found out where to buy crab meat, and we were given a large pollock by one of the local fishermen. Walking along the coast road, there were good views across to High Island. It was 1st of July when we headed south, sailing gently towards High Island Sound. As we rounded the Carricrana rocks, the wind died and the engine had to go on. We followed the transit of Fishing Point and Clifton Castle until we rounded Fishing Point into Clifton Bay, where we picked up a visitor's mooring. The Clifton Yacht Club was welcoming. It seems they have very few visitors, Clifton being a bit of a diversion off the route from Arran to Inishbofin. This is a pity because it is a very secure anchorage and it is an interesting dinghy trip up to Clifton town which has all facilities and where we enjoyed a good meal ashore. It also has a good supermarket which enabled us to restock. As we got back to Ariadne, it started to rain, and it rained hard all afternoon. After 2 nights at Clifton, we were facing a forecast of southeast going southwest 3 or 4, increasing 5, possibly 6, and further deterioration after that. If we stayed longer at Clifton, we could be stuck there a week, so we opted to make an early start towards Inishmore in the Aran Islands. With the wind in the southwest, we had flat water, so opted to go through Joyce's Pass, which would save an hour and help us get to Aran before the wind freshened and started to kick up a sea. Joyce's Pass is a narrow passage over 1.5 miles inside Sline Head, which we could now see ahead of us. The pass can be quite difficult to see. This is where a modern electronic plotter is particularly useful, especially if you are not familiar with the area. I found the transit and gently we eased through the gap, which is only about 25 metres wide. A sharp turn to the right and out into the open sea. Looking back, we couldn't even see the pass. Although it was close-hauled most of the way, we had a sparkling sail from Sline Head to Aran, with the wind veering and freeing as we approached Inishmore. The seas also dropped as we came under the lee of Aran. By early afternoon, we were on a buoy at Kilronan, the main harbour on Inishmore. The wind freshened steadily, and it blew very hard overnight and all the next day. There were 2 other English boats there, and as the wind died, we visited Jenny B, an island packet, and the crew of Annis called aboard after their shopping trip ashore. Both boats were northbound. The following day was suitable for the northbound boats, so we watched them depart, but we opted to wait 1 day more for the seas to subside before tackling the 80-mile leg back to Dingle. During the late morning, there was a commotion on the beach with dozens of children going into the sea in supervised groups. It seems that each June for 2 weeks, there are organised swimming lessons for all the children on the island. It looked very cold. The 7th of July offered a weather window. Inevitably, there would be some swell, and this would be difficult for Dan, but it was probably the best opportunity we would have for several days. So, at first light, we were away with the wind at west-northwest 4. We made our way past Straw Island and through Gregory Sound. The sky threatened gusty weather, so we tucked in a reef at 0800. We were going well, but the seas meant Dan had to stay below and lie down. The motion was too violent for her to get into the cockpit, and she was not happy down below. Stugron and sleep were the prescription. We were cracking along as this Nobletech display shows. Most of the day, we were travelling at over 6 knots. At midday, we were 7 miles west of Loop Head at the Shannon entrance, but the waves were such that we saw it only occasionally. By early afternoon, we could see Loop Head, Kerry Head on the south bank of the Shannon, and Great Blasket. This was fast sailing, but the seas were still about 2 metres. The tide turned against us and the seas got rougher for a while, but the wind eased. So, to maintain speed, the reef was shaken out. Gradually, Mount Brandon and the Three Sisters, key headlands on the Dingle Peninsula, emerged out of the sea. By 16:30, we were approaching Sybil Point at the north end of Blasket Sound. By now, the adverse tide was slackening. Once through Blasket Sound and past the ominously named Cure Rock, we headed past Slee Head towards Dingle. The day mark is mounted at the top of a most impressive cliff. Anyone approaching Dingle close to the coast has to keep a good lookout for Crow Rock. I had the camera running as we entered Dingle, and suddenly fungi breached right alongside. We felt welcome. By 1945, we were alongside in Dingle Marina, the first time we had been on a berth and had direct access to water and electricity since we left Dingle 2.5 weeks earlier. We had covered 81 miles in 14 hours at an average speed of just below 6 knots. We needed at least one clear day to recover from the vigorous passage from Inishmore, but it gave us the opportunity to restock. I was puzzled by the weather patterns and sent a text message to my sister, who is a BBC weather presenter. She consulted the experts and they advised that the jet stream was still about and likely to be over the entrance to the channel by the weekend with very strong winds. This gave us the clue. We had previously spent 10 days in Dingle, so we decided that we would move on to the Kenmare River and find places to hide if necessary. By 0600 we were on our way, motoring clear of Dingle, with a brief farewell from fungi. With a very light northerly breeze, we motor-sailed past Bray Head. Looking back, we could see Mount Brandon unusually clear of cloud, and we also got a last view of the Blaskets. It was not until 0930 that a light west-southwest breeze filled in and enabled us to sail. By then we were passing Puffin Island and getting a very good view of the Skelligs out to sea. Gradually, the aspect changed until both of the Skelligs and the Lemon Rock were in a single transit. By mid-morning, the wind had faded and we motored gently past Derry Nan and into the Kenmare River. We were able to pole out the Genoa and drift gently up the river until we reached Sneem, where we picked up a visitor's buoy. On our last visit to Sneem, we had sat out a gale and watched the rain battering down on the cabin roof. It looked like it was going to be the same again. However, the wind was due to freshen from southeast and veer through southwest, making Sneem rather exposed. So the next afternoon, we proceeded further upriver under Genoa only, with a view to sheltering among the islands at Duncarron. As we approached Duncarron, it was evident that the harbour would be quite exposed, so after a brief examination, we crossed to the other side of the river and anchored behind Dinish Island. The anchor chain was so badly tangled that it took us nearly an hour to clear the mess. This anchorage barely rates a mention in any of the pilot books. It turned out to be quite a find. It is well sheltered from northeast through south to west and has good, clean holding. Moreover, there is now an activity centre with restaurant and a fish factory that sells retail. Next day, the 11th of July, gales were forecast and it rained hard all day. In the evening, the wind started to veer and we were a little less protected, but it was still a comfortable anchorage. On the 12th, the forecast was for southwest 5 to 6, going southwest to south 4 to 6, and then backing to southeast overnight. We went ashore to Don's restaurant for lunch. We motored back to Duncarron in the afternoon, but found we couldn't get sufficiently under the lee of the islands, so returned to the Dinish anchorage for the night. A short weather window appeared, so we decided to go back down the river during the morning with the intention of going to Ardgroom, which we had not visited before. As we proceeded downriver, the wind became very gusty, so we diverted back into Sneem for the night. It was next morning before we motored into the little harbour at Ardgroom. The approach involves using very long transits among the fish farms and is quite tricky, but it was well worth it. We spent 2 nights in Ardgroom while the rain fell and the wind blew. Within the harbour there is plenty of shelter to the west and south, and a low spit to the north provides some protection while allowing a full view across the river. When it rains, the waterfalls are splendid, reminiscent of the ones we saw in the Sounds in New Zealand. I had a brief walk ashore and found the lanes full of flowers. We were now halfway through July and more severe weather was expected within a few days. So before 0700 we weighed anchor and started motoring down the Kenmare. Not for the first time, the Fluxgate compass failed, so we had to rely on the wind vane steering even while motoring. Fortunately, after motor sailing on the port tack for a while, we were able to lay a course that would clear the intervening headland before we dropped down to Dursey Sound. As we cleared Dursey Sound, the very dangerous Cat Rock showed itself quite clearly in the swell. It was then a broad reach past Black Ball Head and into the sound behind Bear Island. After passing Dunboy Bay, we were surprised to see the large number of fishing boats laid up in Castletown Bearhaven. This sound is well marked, including a wreck that does not seem to have deteriorated since we were here in 2003. Hungry Hill is a major landmark that we could see as we turned into Lawrence Cove on Bear Island. That evening, we took the dinghy across to the village where we had a very pleasant meal at the Caterpillar restaurant, now run by a Brit called David Andrews. He had taken it over for the summer months from Kitty. Disposal of rubbish has become a desperate problem for cruising yachts in Ireland, and to be able to dispose of one black bag of rubbish for €10 seemed like quite a good deal. Apparently, the Irish government has really ramped up the price without making provision for itinerant visitors such as yachtsmen. The next morning dawned bright and clear with a flat calm, so just before 9 we motored away from the marina and headed up Bantry Bay. The Rowan Carrigmore Lighthouse is quite a distinctive feature on the northern shoreline nestled under Hungry Hill. We tucked in behind Whiddy Island. This enabled me to go ashore and do some essential shopping in Bantry town. This is a working town, not a tourist trap, and I felt it was underrated in the pilot books. After lunch we motored out of the north end of Bantry Harbour and were able to sail once clear of Whiddy Island and beat almost into Glengariff Harbour. Without question, this has to be one of the best yachting harbours in Europe. It is completely protected in beautiful surroundings. The following day, we sat tight with a forecast north to northwest 4 to 6, increasing 6 to gale 8, moderating overnight. The northwesterly winds that had helped us work our way down from Dingle had prevented our friend Roy Dowman from proceeding further west than Baltimore. Now his time had run out, and he decided to head back towards the Scilly Islands. By text, we agreed that the weather did not look too bad. We set off under full sail, beating gently down Bantry Bay round a tanker that was just about to leave the single point mooring. It was pleasant sailing. As we came back across the bay, the wind veered and freshened. Within 30 minutes, we had 2 reefs in the main and a well-rolled Genoa, and 15 minutes later, we furled the Genoa completely and motor sailed for about an hour, making very little headway against the short, steep sea. We were glad to gain the shelter of Adrigole. We later learned that Roy had had to heave to on the Labadie bank for 6 hours, while the wind had blown at more than 40 knots and quite a nasty sea had built up. What we had both overlooked had been the presence of some troughs that were mentioned in the forecasts, even though there were no fronts. We like Adrigole, but the weather was threatening to be wet and windy, so next morning we sailed gently towards Lawrence Cove in what we thought was the calm before the storm. We had another peaceful day in the marina before setting off the following morning. Our course took us back through the Bear Island Channel past Dunboy Bay. We had hoped to be able to sail, but the west-southwest wind was fairly light and there was a curious cross-sea that shook the wind out of the sails. We crossed Bantry, past Sheep's Head and reached towards Three Castle Head. As we reached the mizzen, the tide turned against us and we went very close inshore to keep as much out of the current as possible. As we headed towards Crookhaven, we could see the Fastnet out to sea. Carefully, we rounded the Alderman Rocks and passed the Black Horse Beacon before passing Crookhaven Light and the strange towers that guard the entrance to this harbour. A large depression was due to move up the west coast of Ireland, and we were expected to get a southeasterly gale overnight as it moved in. With this in mind, we anchored behind Rock Island to try and get some protection in case the wind blew straight into the harbour. That night, the predicted gale just did not happen. The following day, we were expecting a blow and the wind was certainly fresh. We had a good meal ashore in one of the pubs. An interesting Canadian couple came on board. They keep their boat in Europe. During the day, the wind went round into the southwest and freshened until it was blowing force 7 overnight. We were now anchored in the wrong part of the harbour, and I stood anchor watch from 0400. Although the weather was well into an uncertain patch, it looked as though a period of westerly winds would allow us to explore the little harbours of Roaring Water Bay. This would mean relatively short passages but tricky pilotage through rocky areas. Our first short passage would be to Scull. There was a brisk breeze blowing and it would be a run, so we set the main and left the Genoa rolled up. There was a gentle swell outside as we ran quite quickly towards Castle Point. Rather than go through Barrel Sound, I opted to go between Barrel Rocks and Dromader. With a residual swell from the day before, the rocks with a white surf fringe looked very threatening. We had to jibe a couple of times before running past Goat Island into the Long Island Channel. Shortly after passing the Cush Buoy, we found Copple Point and the northeastern tip of Long Island abeam. We then turned into Scull Harbour, passing the Bull Rock Beacon. I went ashore to top up on stores and to see whether we could buy some fish or shellfish. I succeeded in every respect, returning to the boat with all necessary stores, some beautiful monkfish and a kilo of fresh mussels. Next morning, Dan came ashore with me because I had found where we could buy lobster at a very reasonable price. It was the first time either of us had eaten lobster on a paper plate with a plastic fork. I also went to an internet cafe and studied the weather maps. The picture was not good. Looking 3 days ahead, the weather was clearly set to deteriorate. Thereafter, right up to 10 days, vigorous weather systems would be in evidence. There appeared to be a short weather window, so we changed our plans and decided that we would attempt to get to the Scilly Islands the next day. Accordingly, we returned to the boat and set off across the bay among the islands. This was interesting pilotage, and we had to be particularly careful of the terrain rocks, although there was enough swell for them to show clearly. Eventually, we anchored in the lee of Sherkin Island, well placed for an early departure. Well before 6 in the morning, we were motoring past Lot's Wife and heading out into a lifting sea. Only an hour later, a new forecast suggested that the gales were moving in sooner than expected. We did not fancy repeating Roy Dowman's experience. We took the decision to turn back even though we knew that this would mean we would be stuck in Baltimore for several days. There was a plus side. It gave us a full day to go ashore on Sherkin Island and explore, something we had not done before. During the course of the day, we monitored the wave height at M3, the weather buoy southwest of the Mizzen Head. It reached 6.2 metres. It was clearly going to blow for at least a couple of days, so we retreated up the river island to an anchorage that was well described in a book called Cruising Cork and Kerry that had been given to us by the crew of Jenny B. The wind freshened throughout the night, and it was not particularly comfortable because the wind shifted to come straight up quite a long reach of the river, and in wind over tide conditions we were sheering about and snatching at the anchor. The plot also shows that at one point we must have dragged. From the pilot book, we learned that there was a boatyard further up the river. I rang Donal O'Donovan, who willingly offered us a berth on his pontoon. Gently, we worked our way upriver on the top of the tide and made fast outside an old fishing boat. Altogether, we spent 4 nights at the Old Court shipyard, during which time I went into Skibbereen a couple of times, either with a lift from the boatyard staff or using the bus. Despite the weather, this was in some ways a pleasant rural interlude. I noticed that one of the boats hauled out in the yard was one that I had seen earlier in Crookhaven. Diana and Andy had to end their cruise somewhat early because of a broken forestay fitting. It turns out that they are near neighbours of ours in Southampton. One evening, they came aboard for dinner. On the 29th of July, we decided to move downriver into Baltimore in case a weather window developed that would enable us to fetch the Scilly Islands. We anchored in Church Bay, which is almost behind Baltimore and protected from nearly every wind direction. For the next 2 days, it blew hard between south and southwest, occasionally exceeding gale force. During the first night, as we had very little sea room, I had a second anchor ready and stood anchor watch through the night. On the 1st of August, the forecast of northwest 5 or 6 and moderating looked quite promising, so we set off at 06:30 and headed for the Scilly Islands. With a reef in the main, we were going fast, and in the first 12 hours we covered 75 miles. The wind kept veering, and eventually we jibed. We did not notice that a reefing line had got round a winch on the mast, and it broke as we jibed. Then, unfortunately, the wind went dead astern and dropped. By 0300 next morning, the boat speed was down to less than 4 knots. We were concerned to make the Scilly Islands before the wind backed and freshened again, so the engine had to go on. Shortly after 0900, we were on a buoy in New Grimsby. The next 2 days were grey and windy, and it was a little bit lumpy on the anchorage during the wind over tide conditions. The following day, Alistair and Carol and their friends arrived after a very rough trip from Newlyn and took the buoy immediately astern of us. We all had a good dinner on Ariadne, followed by a pub lunch the following day at the New Inn on Tresco. That afternoon, we departed over Tresco Flats under power, heading past the Ragledge Beacon, the Helman Beacon, and heading towards the TV tower on St Mary's. The next beacon was Crow Rock, which we passed before picking up the transit into St Helens Pool. For the second time, we saw Amica, a boat we had first met in Scotland and more recently in Baltimore. They and the crew of a pretty Holman called April Duster came on board. The evening was still and clear, and it was possible to photograph the moonlight. The next day, 8th of August, was my birthday. To celebrate, we rowed over to St Helens and I climbed to the top to get this 360-degree panoramic. To the north of the island, we first see Round Island with its lighthouse. As we move round further, St Martin's comes into view. In the foreground, we see St Helens Gap, the northern entrance to St Helens Pool. In the far distance are the Eastern Rocks. Further round, we see St Mary's in the distance. The anchorage feels wild and remote, but is in fact protected from just about every wind direction. We are now looking across Old Grimsby to Tresco. These rock ridges break up the waves in westerly gales and provide almost complete protection to the anchorage. And back round to the north again, we see the magnificent Men o' Vore. Later, I explored the pool in the dinghy. We had now had an enjoyable week in the Scilly Islands. Staying longer would be pushing our luck. So on the 9th at 06:20 we weighed and motored out to the south. For the first part of the passage we were accompanied by Galatea, a Trinity light buoy vessel. Most of the rest of the passage was motor sailing. We passed just south of the Wolf Rock. As we approached the Lizard, there seemed to be a lot of activity, and we watched a lifeboat day demonstration. After rounding the Lizard, we were able to sail as far as the Manacles. By 1745, Ariadne was anchored off Durgan in the Helford River. We spent a couple of days in the Fowl, during which Mark replaced the broken reefing line in the boom. We spent the final week pottering back up the channel, calling at places we know and like. The first stop was at Foy. Passing Plymouth, we came across a group of canoes, rowing boats and gigs on their annual trip out to the Eddystone. Approaching Start Point, we were overtaken by Bagheera, the boat that we had met in Dingle. In the Dart, we renewed our acquaintance with the maltsters at Tuckenhay in Bow Creek above Dittisham. At Portland, we took the inshore passage. After brief stops at Weymouth and Studland, we were back in the Solent on the 22nd of August.